The harsh whispers flew across Pinewood Springs like tumbleweeds on a windy day, cutting deeper than any knife as Zara Keller stepped onto the weathered boardwalk of the general store. At 32, most women in the frontier town of 1876 Colorado were long married with half-grown children, not unmarried shopkeepers with silver threads beginning to weave through their chestnut hair. "There she goes again," came Mrs. Peabody's not-so-quiet voice from behind her fan. "Getting more supplies for that sad little dress shop. As if anyone would trust a spinster to make their wedding gown." Zara clutched her order list tighter, her knuckles whitening. 5 years ago, after her father's passing, she'd taken over his small storefront and transformed it into the only dress shop in 3 counties. While her business survived, her prospects for marriage had withered with each passing season. Not that she'd had many to begin with. Her forthright manner and education had narrowed her options considerably. "Good morning, Mr. Hanson," she called to the storekeeper, ignoring the tittering women at the corner table. "I've come for my monthly fabric order." The kindly older man nodded, retrieving a package from beneath the counter. "Got your special order in from Denver, Miss Keller, that blue silk you've been waiting for." Zara's eyes brightened. "Wonderful. Mrs. Abernathy's daughter will be delighted. Her wedding dress will be the talk of the territory." The bell above the door jingled, and the atmosphere in the store shifted like a change in barometric pressure. Heavy boots thudded across the wooden floor, spurs clinking with each deliberate step. The conversations hushed, then erupted into urgent whispers. Zara turned, curiosity getting the better of her propriety, and found herself looking up quite a ways up into the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a man who seemed to have materialized from the pages of a dime novel, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin, and a quiet intensity that commanded attention without demanding it. "Zachary Xander," Mr. Hanson called out, his voice warm with recognition. "Didn't expect you back in these parts so soon." The stranger Zachary nodded, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Trail ended sooner than expected. Delivered the herd to the railroad 2 days early." His voice was deep and smooth, like good whiskey, with none of the rough edges Zara associated with most cowboys. There was something refined beneath the trail dust that clung to his denim and leather. "Ladies," he acknowledged the room with a slight bow of his head, his eyes passing over the group before landing on Zara. Something flickered in his gaze interest, perhaps before he turned back to Hanson. "Need supplies. Planning to stay a while this time." The twittering from Mrs. Peabody's corner grew louder. "Well, I declare," she stage whispered to her companions. "Zach Xander looking at our old maid Zara. Perhaps he needs glasses after so long on the trail." Heat rushed to Zara's cheeks, but she lifted her chin and gathered her package. "Thank you, Mr. Hanson. I'll see you next month." As she moved toward the door, Zachary stepped aside, his hand briefly touching the small of her back as he guided her past. The simple, courteous gesture sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Miss," he said quietly, holding the door. "Thank you, Mr. Xander," she replied, not meeting his eyes. Outside, the October air carried the crisp promise of winter. Zara hurried down the boardwalk toward her shop, trying to ignore the peculiar sensation that had settled in her chest at the cowboy's touch. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Peabody's voice carrying through the open doorway. "That Zara Keller is well past her prime. 32 and still unmarried. A decent man wants a young bride who can bear him strong sons, not some dried-up old madam." The deep voice cut through the gossip like a knife. "Where I come from, a man doesn't judge a woman by her years but by her character. And from what I can see, Miss Keller has more of that in her little finger than some folks have in their entire body." Zara froze mid-step, hardly daring to breathe. "Well, I never," Mrs. Peabody sputtered. "Perhaps you should, madam," came the calm reply. "Perhaps you should." The door closed, cutting off any further conversation, but Zara remained rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one had defended her against the town gossips before, certainly not a stranger. Certainly not a man like Zachary Xander. She forced herself to continue walking, clutching her package to her chest like a shield. It wouldn't do to read too much into a simple act of decency. Cowboys came and went through Pinewood Springs with the seasons. This one would be no different. Yet for the rest of the day, as she cut patterns and pinned fabric for Mrs. Abernathy's daughter's wedding gown, Zara found herself replaying those blue eyes and that deep voice in her mind more times than she cared to admit. 3 days later, the bell above Zara's shop door jangled, and she looked up from her sewing machine to find Zachary Xander filling her doorway, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up considerably since their brief encounter at the general store. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved, and he wore a crisp white shirt beneath a simple black vest. "Mr. Xander," she said, setting aside her work and rising from her chair. "How may I help you?" He stepped into the shop, looking slightly out of place among the bolts of fabric and half-finished dresses. "Miss Keller," he cleared his throat, "I'm in need of a new shirt or two. Hanson at the general store suggested you might be able to help." Zara raised an eyebrow. While she occasionally made men's shirts, it wasn't her usual work. The mercantile typically carried ready-made clothing for men. Did he now? A faint smile touched Zachary's lips. "Well, he might have mentioned that after I asked where your shop was located." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Zara found herself at a rare loss for words. "I can pay well," he added, misinterpreting her silence. "I know it's not your usual work." "It's not that," she said, recovering her composure. "I'm just surprised. Most men in these parts don't seek out custom shirts." "I'm not most men, Miss Keller." The simple statement carried no bravado, just quiet confidence, so I'm beginning to see. She gestured to a small stool near her measuring area. "If you're serious about the shirts, I'll need to take your measurements." He nodded, setting his hat on a nearby table and standing where she indicated. Zara retrieved her measuring tape and notebook, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach as she approached him. "Arms out, please," she instructed, slipping into her professional demeanor. He complied, and she set to work, carefully maintaining a proper distance as she measured his broad shoulders, the length of his arms, and the circumference of his neck. When she needed to measure his chest, she had to step closer, and the scent of soap and leather enveloped her. "You've been in Pinewood Springs before?" she asked, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the sound of her own heartbeat. "A few times. Usually just passing through with cattle drives." His voice rumbled near her ear as she stretched the tape across his back. "This is the first time I've stayed more than a night or two." "What's changed?" She moved to measure his waist, keeping her eyes firmly on the numbers. "Bought land. The old McAllister Ranch about 5 miles out of town." Her hands stilled. "The Flying M, that's 2,000 acres. 2,347, he corrected. "Good water, good grazing, been saving for it for 8 years." Zara stepped back, regarding him with new interest. A man with land was a man with roots. "You're planning to settle here, then?" He nodded. "Time to stop wandering, build something that lasts." Their eyes met, and for a moment Zara felt as though she could see years of hard work and carefully nurtured dreams in his gaze. "Well," she said, breaking the connection and returning to her notebook, "I should have these shirts ready in about a week. What color would you prefer? Lady's choice, he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting. Though I'm partial to blue. Blue it is, then. She scribbled in her notebook, not looking up. And perhaps a white one as well for Sundays. Planning my wardrobe already, Miss Keller. The teasing note in his voice brought her eyes back to his face. Merely being practical, Mr. Xander, she replied primly, though she couldn't quite suppress her smile. Zach, he corrected. If you're going to be dressing me, you might as well use my name. Heat rose to her cheeks at his choice of words. That would hardly be proper, Mr. Xander. Nothing improper about a name, Miss Keller. He retrieved his hat. But I'll wait until you're ready. He placed some money on the table, far more than the shirts were worth, and headed for the door. Mr. Xander, she called after him. This is too much. He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. Consider it an investment, Miss Keller, in future business. With that, he was gone, leaving Zara staring at the space he'd occupied, the measuring tape still clutched in her hands and her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. Over the next 2 weeks, Zachary Xander became a regular sight in Pinewood Springs. He hired local men to help repair the main house and outbuildings at the Flying M, purchased supplies and furniture, and began to assemble a small herd of cattle. Each endeavor brought him into town, and more often than not, he found reasons to visit Zara's shop. First, it was to check on his shirts, then to order another, then to ask her opinion on curtain fabric for the ranch house. With each visit, their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned he was 36, born in Pennsylvania but drawn west after the war. He'd worked as a cattle driver, a ranch hand, and eventually a trail boss, saving every penny toward his dream of owning land. He read books, real books, not just dime novels, and could quote Shakespeare when the mood struck him. He learned about her childhood in Boston, her move west with her father after her mother's death, and her determination to make something of herself beyond being someone's wife. He listened to her dreams of expanding her shop, perhaps opening a second location in Denver someday, with an attentiveness that no man had ever shown her before. The town noticed their growing friendship, of course. The whispers followed Zara more intensely than ever, trying to trap herself a rancher before her looks fade completely. He's just being kind to the poor spinster. Mark my words, once he's settled, he'll court Abernathy's girl, 18 and pretty as a picture. Zara did her best to ignore them, but the barbs found their mark. When Zachary invited her to Sunday dinner at the newly renovated ranch house, her first instinct was to refuse. People will talk, she told him when he stopped by the shop with the invitation. People already talk, he replied, leaning against her cutting table. Would you really let them decide your life for you? Put that way, it sounded ridiculous. No, she admitted, but I've built something here, Zach. My reputation matters. His expression softened at her use of his given name, a slip she'd been making more frequently of late. Which is why I've invited Pastor and Mrs. Whitley to join us, and Mr. Hanson, all very respectable, relief and something like disappointment mingled in her chest. A dinner party, then. This time. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I want you to see the place, Zara. To know what I'm building out there. The way he said it, like her opinion mattered, like he was building it for her, made her throat tighten. I'd be honored, she managed. His smile was worth every whisper she'd endure. Sunday arrived crisp and clear. Zara wore her best dress, a deep burgundy wool with subtle lace trim that she'd made the previous winter. She'd spent extra time on her hair, arranging the chestnut waves into a style that softened the effect of the silver strands rather than trying to hide them. Mr. Hanson offered to drive her out to the ranch in his buggy, saving her the need to hire transportation. As they traveled the winding road out of town, Zara's stomach nodded with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. "You know," Hansen said as they crested a hill, "I've known that boy since he first came through these parts driving cattle for the Cartwright outfit. Always stood apart from the others, quieter, more thoughtful." Zara nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Asked about you every time he passed through. How's the dressmaker's daughter, he'd say, still making those fancy gowns?" She turned to him in surprise. "He knew who I was, before this autumn," Hansen chuckled. "Knew you." "Girl, he planned his cattle drives to pass through Pinewood Springs just to catch a glimpse of you working in your shop window. Been doing it for years." Zara's heart skipped. "That can't be true, as I live and breathe." Hansen flicked the reins gently. "When your father passed, and you took over the shop instead of closing it up, Zach told me you were the bravest woman he'd ever seen. Said he was going to own land worthy of a woman like that someday." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes. "Why didn't he ever speak to me before?" "What did he have to offer you then? A wandering cowboy with nothing but dreams and dust?" Hansen shook his head. "Man has pride, Zara. He wanted to come to you as an equal." As they rounded the final bend, the flying M came into view. Zara gasped. The transformation was remarkable. The once dilapidated main house now stood proud, its fresh white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The barn and corrals had been rebuilt, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. Zachary was waiting on the porch, dressed in one of the shirts. She'd made him the blue one that matched his eyes. When he spotted their buggy, he bounded down the steps with boyish enthusiasm that made Zara's heart swell. "You came," he said, helping her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I said I would." Her voice came out softer than intended. He led her proudly through the house, showing her the parlor with its new furniture, the dining room set for their guests, and the kitchen where Mrs. Lopez, a widow from town he'd hired as housekeeper, was preparing dinner. "It's wonderful, Zach," she said, genuinely impressed by the care he'd taken with every detail. "Come see the best part," he replied, leading her through the back door onto a covered porch that overlooked the valley. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, with the ranch spread out before them. "This is what I worked for," he said quietly, standing beside her at the railing. "A place to build a life, a future." Zara could see at the cattle dotting the hillsides, children running across the yard, years unfolding in peace and prosperity. It was a beautiful vision. "Any woman would be lucky to share it with you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Zachary turned to face her, his expression serious. "I don't want any woman, Zara." Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Pastor and Mrs. Whitley. The moment broke, and they returned to their roles as host and guest. Dinner was pleasant, the conversation flowing easily among the small group. Pastor Whitley complimented the renovation, Mrs. Whitley praised the meal, and Hansen told stories of the ranch's history. Throughout it all, Zara felt Zachary's eyes on her, warm and intent. As the evening drew to a close, he insisted on driving her back to town himself, despite Hansen's offer to take her. "I need to speak with Miss Keller about some additional furnishings for the house," he explained smoothly. "Business matters." In the buggy, under a sky scattered with stars, they were finally alone. The rhythmic clop of hooves filled the silence as Zara gathered her courage. "Mr. Hansen told me something interesting today," she began. "Oh." Zachary's voice was carefully neutral. "He said you've known who I was for years, that you used to ask about me whenever you passed through town." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, softly, "Hansen talks too much." "Is it true?" he sighed, his breath visible in the cool night air. "Yes." Why didn't you ever speak to me? What would I have said? Hello, Miss Keller, I'm a dusty cowboy with nothing to my name, but I think you're the most beautiful, courageous woman I've ever seen. He shook his head. You deserved better than that. So you waited, all these years. I built something worthy of you. His voice was rough with emotion. Or tried to. Zara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. And now, Zachary pulled the buggy to a stop on a ridge overlooking the town. Pinewood Springs lay below them, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkness. Now I'm done waiting. He turned to face her, taking her gloved hands in his. Zara Keller, I've loved you from afar for 8 years. I'd like your permission to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife. Tears spilled over onto her cheeks before she could stop them. The town will talk. They'll say I'm too old, that you could have any young girl, let them talk. His voice was fierce. You're the bride I've waited for, no one else. He reached up to brush away her tears, his touch impossibly gentle. I don't want some young girl who's never known hardship or built something with her own 2 hands. I want a partner, an equal. I want you, Zara, just as you are. In the starlight, with the town spread out below them and the ranch waiting in the distance, Zara made her choice. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Zachary responded instantly, one hand cupping her face while the other drew her closer. The kiss deepened. Years of unspoken longing poured into a single moment that seemed to stop time itself. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes? Zara laughed, the sound bright and free in the night air. Yes, Zachary Xander. That's a yes. True to his word, Zachary courted her properly. Every Sunday he attended church beside her, impervious to the stares and whispers. Twice a week, he took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant where they talked for hours about books, dreams, and plans for the ranch. He brought her wildflowers and hand-carved wooden trinkets, simple gifts that meant more than any expensive baubles. The town's gossip reached a fever pitch when, after just 2 months of courtship, Zachary proposed formally, presenting Zara with his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond. Too fast, some whispered. She'll never give him children at her age, others predicted darkly. He'll regret it when the bloom of romance fades, Mrs. Peabody declared to anyone who would listen. But something unexpected happened as winter deepened. The more Zachary remained steadfast in his devotion, the more the town's opinion began to shift. It started with Hanson defending them vigorously to his customers. Then Mrs. Lopez sang Zara's praises while shopping for the ranch. Pastor Whitley delivered a sermon on the virtue of seeing with the heart rather than the eyes. By Christmas, when they announced their intention to marry in the spring, many of the same people who had mocked Zara were asking if she might make their new dresses or seeking Zachary's advice on cattle breeding. Not everyone changed their tune, Mrs. Peabody remained stubbornly critical, but enough did that Zara no longer felt like an outsider in her own town. See, Zachary told her on Christmas Eve as they sat by the fire in her small apartment above the shop. People come around when you stand your ground. Or when a handsome rancher with 2,000 acres makes his preferences clear, she teased, leaning into his embrace. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. 2,347, he corrected, as he always did. And it's not my land that changed their minds. It's seeing us together, seeing that this is right. Zara tilted her face up to his. It is right, isn't it? This isn't too fast. You're not, he silenced her with a kiss, tender and reassuring. 8 years of waiting isn't fast, Zara. And the only thing I regret is not speaking to you sooner. They were married on the 1st day of May, 1877, with apple blossoms scenting the air and new grass carpeting the hills around the flying M. Zara wore a gown of ivory silk that she'd spent months perfecting, with delicate embroidery along the bodice and sleeves. Zachary wore a new black suit with the blue shirt she'd made him when they first spoke. The entire town turned out for the celebration, even Mrs. Peabody, who sniffed suspiciously throughout the ceremony but was seen dabbing her eyes when the couple exchanged vows. "I promise to love you as you are, to build our dreams together, and to never let you forget that you are the woman I waited for," Zachary said, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard where they'd set up for the occasion. "I promise to love you fearlessly, to be your partner in all things, and to make this house a home filled with joy," Zara replied, no longer caring about the silver in her hair or the lines at the corners of her eyes. When Pastor Whitley pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary swept her into a kiss that left no doubt in anyone's mind about the depth of his feelings. The reception lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under lantern light. As the last guests departed, Zachary led Zara back to the porch where he'd first shown her his vision for their future. "Happy, Mrs. Xander?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "Completely." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Though I still can't believe you waited so long without saying a word. Some things are worth waiting for." He tilted her chin up, his eyes reflecting the emerging stars. "And some people are worth building a life for." Later that night, as they lay tangled in the sheets of their marriage bed, Zara traced the contours of her husband's face with wondering fingers. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "That I'm glad you didn't want some young girl," she admitted. "That I'm glad you saw something in me worth waiting for." His expression grew serious. "Youth fades, Zara. Beauty changes. But who you are, your spirit, your determination, your heart, that's what I fell in love with. That's what I'll love when we're both old and gray." She smiled, tears of joy gathering in her eyes. "We'll grow old together then." "That's the plan, Mrs. Xander." He pulled her closer. "That's always been the plan." Spring gave way to summer and summer to autumn. The Flying M prospered under their joint care, with Zachary managing the ranch while Zara continued her dress shop in town, hiring 2 young apprentices to help with the increased business. When winter came again, bringing with it their first Christmas as husband and wife, Zara had a special gift for Zachary: news that, despite the whispers and doubts, they would be welcoming a child in the summer. His joy was boundless, his care for her during the pregnancy both tender and fierce. When their daughter was born in July of 1878, a healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, the last of the town's criticism fell silent. They named her Hope, for that was what their love had given them both. Hope for a future brighter than either had dared to imagine alone. 3 years later, a son joined their family, followed by another daughter 2 years after that. The Flying M expanded, as did Zara's business, which grew to include a second location in Denver, managed by one of her former apprentices. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where they'd first shared their dreams, surrounded by the evidence of those dreams fulfilled, Zachary took Zara's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question an echo of many such conversations over the years. Zara looked out at their children playing in the yard, at the prosperous ranch stretching to the horizon, and finally at the man beside her, older now, with strands of silver matching her own, but with the same steadfast love in his eyes. "Not a single one," she answered, leaning in for a kiss that still held all the promise of their first. "Some things truly are worth waiting for." And as the sun set over the land they'd built together, Zara Keller Xander knew that the whispers had been wrong. She hadn't been too old. She'd been exactly right at exactly the right time, for the man who had waited for her and the life they were meant to share.